Antarctica does not care about you. I want to be precise about that because precision matters here and because the version of Antarctica that exists in most people's imagination, the dramatic, cinematic, dangerous but beautiful version, is a comfortable lie. The real Antarctica is not dramatic. It is not beautiful in any way that involves you. It is the most indifferent place on the surface of the Earth. A continent that existed for millions of years before anything capable of finding it remarkable arrived, and that will exist for millions of years after the last thing capable of finding it remarkable is gone, and that has never once adjusted itself to accommodate the difference. I arrived at Vostok Research Station Bravo in late March. Not the famous Vostok Station, the Russian one, the one with the subglacial lake, the one that appears in the academic literature and the documentary films and the kind of science journalism that makes cold places sound romantic. Station Bravo was different. Station Bravo was newer, smaller, and operated by a private research consortium that had filed the appropriate permits with the Antarctic Treaty System and had built its facility 40 kilometers southeast of the original Vostok site in a location that the consortium's geological survey had identified as, and I am using the official language from the survey report, a site of significant subsurface interest. I was the station's new glaciologist, replacing Dr. Hartwell, who had left his position mid-contract, which the consortium's HR department described as a personal decision and which the two remaining station members described, separately and with the specific careful phrasing of people who have agreed not to say more than they are saying, as a necessary departure. I did not press on what necessary departure meant during the initial orientation. I had been in research postings long enough to know that every station had its history and that the history was best understood through residents rather than briefing. You learn a place by being in it. By watching how the people who have been there longer than you move through it. By noticing what they don't mention. The station had 6 members including me. Dr. Chen was the station director. A geophysicist, 50s, with the specific economy of expression of someone who had spent years in isolated postings and had distilled communication down to its functional minimum. She shook my hand when I arrived and said, "Welcome to Bravo. You'll want to see the ice cores before anything else. Not the station layout. Not the safety protocols. Not the standard orientation sequence that every research posting required before you were cleared for field work. The ice cores." That told me something. That told me the ice cores were the center of gravity of this station in a way that superseded every other consideration, including the standard institutional protocols that existed precisely because Antarctic research postings had a documented history of going wrong in ways that proper orientation was designed to prevent. I should have asked why the ice cores first. I said, "Show me." The ice core laboratory was in the station's lower level, below the main living and working spaces, accessible by a stairwell that went down further than the station's surface footprint suggested it should. The lower level had a quality that the upper level did not, a coldness that was not the cold of Antarctic air but something that came from below. From deeper than the insulated floor of the facility. A cold that had direction. That was coming up. The cores were stored in a refrigerated archive along one wall. Standard for ice core research, the samples had to be maintained at consistent temperatures to preserve the integrity of the record they contained. What was not standard was the length of them. Ice cores from established Antarctic programs ran to several meters. These ran to something that the labeled measurements told me was 2 kilometers of sample material. Extracted from a depth that the drilling logs, which Chen handed me without comment, showed had reached approximately 3 kilometers below the surface ice. 3 kilometers, I said. 3 kilometers and 400 meters, she said. The drill broke through at that depth. Into a cavity. What kind of cavity? I said. She looked at the cores in their storage. The kind, she said, that the ice does not explain. The cores were not remarkable at first examination. Ice. The layered record of centuries of snowfall and compression. The trapped air bubbles that carried atmospheric samples from across recorded human history and far beyond. The dust and particulates and chemical signatures that glaciologists spend careers learning to read like the oldest text in the world. But at approximately 2.8 kilometers of depth the record changed. Not in the chemistry. Not in the layering. In the character of the ice itself. The material that came out of the drill at 2.8 kilometers and below was different from the ice above it in a way that I spent my first evening in the laboratory failing to adequately characterize in my field notes. Not different in composition. Different in quality. In the way that ice in the deepest cores sometimes carries a quality, a clarity, a stillness, that ice formed in normal conditions does not have. The ice at 2.8 kilometers and below was too still. Not still the way ancient ice is still. Not the stillness of something that has been compressed for millennia and lost its memory of movement. This was a different stillness. The stillness of something that had been still before the ice formed. That the ice had formed around rather than the ice becoming still over time. I wrote in my field notes, sample character below 2.8 kilometers depth inconsistent with expected formation parameters. Recommend full spectroscopic analysis. Note, previous occupant Dr. Hartwell's core analysis records appear incomplete. Last entry dated 6 weeks before departure. Reason for gap unknown. I went to bed. The station at night was the sound of wind against the outer walls and the hum of the heating systems and a silence underneath both of those things that the wind and the heating systems were not quite enough to cover. A deep silence. Coming from below. I lay in my bunk in the assigned residential space and I listened to it and I thought about the word Chen had used. Cavity. Not void. Not space. Not opening or chamber or any of the other words that might describe a geological feature in Antarctic ice. Cavity. The word you use when there is something inside. When the inside is defined not by the absence of material but by the presence of a shape that the material around it has accommodated. At some point I slept. In the morning Chen took me to the drilling site. The site was 2 kilometers from the station. We drove in the station's tracked vehicle through the flat white nothing of the surface ice with the Antarctic sky doing its perpetual overcast above us. The drilling facility was a prefabricated structure set directly into the ice, insulated, pressurized, the kind of engineering that cost significant money and that a private research consortium had spent without apparent hesitation. Inside the drilling facility the borehole was capped. Sealed with a pressure mechanism that required 2 authorizations to open. Chen placed her hand on the cap. The cavity is at the bottom, she said. 3 kilometers and 400 meters. The drill broke through and then the instruments detected the space below and we stopped drilling. Why did you stop? I said. She looked at the cap. Because the instruments detected something else, she said. When the drill broke through into the cavity. What did they detect? I said. She removed her hand from the cap. The cavity is not empty, she said. The instruments detected structure. Inside the cavity. Below the ice. In a space that has been sealed under 3 kilometers of ice for a period that our dating places at. She stopped. How long? I said. She turned and walked to the facility entrance. Come back to the station, she said. I need to show you the instrument data. And I need to tell you about Hartwell. What actually happened to Hartwell? I looked at the cap borehole. At the seal over 3 kilometers of ice. At the cold that was coming up from below even through the facility's insulation. Not the cold of ice. Something colder than ice. Something that had been down there for longer than Chen had finished saying. And was still there. Waiting in the dark of a cavity that the instrument said was not empty. That contained structure. That contained something. Hartwell's records were kept in a locked partition on the station's research server. Not password protected in the standard way, not the routine access restriction of a researcher maintaining confidentiality over unpublished data. Locked in a way that required Chen's personal authorization to open, which told me that the locking had been done by someone other than Hartwell. That it had been done after Hartwell left. That whatever was in the partition had been assessed by someone with the authority to restrict access and had been found to require restriction. Chen opened it for me that evening in the station's main research room. She sat beside me while I read, and she did not speak while I read, and when I looked up from the screen she was looking at the wall opposite with the expression of someone who had read what I was reading many times and was now somewhere else in their head while their body remained in the chair. I will tell you what Hartwell's records contained. Not all of it. Not because I am protecting anything, the time for protection has passed in ways I will explain before this account is finished, but because the volume of it, the density of 6 months of one researcher's increasingly fractured documentation, does not serve the account as well as the shape of it. The outline. The progression from scientific record to something else. The first 3 months were standard. Drilling logs. Core analysis. Atmospheric sample processing. The particular dry precision of a glaciologist documenting the work of glaciology in the language that the discipline uses, which is the language of measurement and comparison and careful qualification. Hartwell was good. His early records were the records of someone who was methodical and thorough and who had the specific quality of attention that ice core research requires, the ability to find significance in incremental data, to read the long record of a planet's climate in the compressed layers of a frozen column, to be patient with information that reveals itself slowly. The cavity was discovered in month 4. The drill broke through at 3 kilometers and 400 meters on a Tuesday in the Antarctic winter, at 11 p.m. station time, with Hartwell alone in the drilling facility because the overnight monitoring shift was a single-person assignment and it was his week. The drill's resistance changed, the instruments logged the change, a sudden reduction in pressure that indicated the drill tip had entered open space, and Hartwell had stopped the drill and begun the instrument survey of what was below. The instrument data from that survey was the second thing in the partition. The cavity was large. Larger than the instrument readings could fully characterize from the borehole opening. The sonar return suggested a space of significant dimensions, hundreds of meters in diameter, which was not impossible for a subglacial cavity but was at the upper extreme of what the geological record of the region should have supported. The shape of it was irregular but not randomly irregular. The sonar return showed a consistency in the cavity walls that the geological analysis struggled to categorize. Not the smooth walls of a water-carved cavity. Not the fractured walls of a collapse feature. Something in between. Something that had the qualities of both without being fully either. And in the cavity, structure. The sonar return showed it clearly. Features on the cavity floor that rose from the surface in organized patterns. Not stalactites or stalagmites, the geological conditions didn't support calcium carbonate formations at this depth and temperature. Not pressure ridges from the ice above. The features rose at angles that pressure ridges don't produce, in arrangements that pressure ridges don't generate, with a consistency of spacing and proportion that the instrument data logged and that Hartwell's notes described with increasing agitation across the 3 subsequent entries. The word he used first was formations. The word he used by the end of month 4 was structures. Not geological structures. Not the language of a geologist describing a feature. The language of someone describing something that had been made. In month 5, Hartwell lowered a camera through the borehole. The camera was on a cable. Rated for the pressure and temperature differential between the surface and the cavity. Equipped with its own light source. He lowered it slowly, logging the descent in real time, and when it reached the cavity and the light source engaged and the feed returned to the surface, he wrote one sentence in his log before any description of what the camera showed. The sentence was, "I need to be very careful about how I document this." I understand that sentence now in a way I did not understand it when I first read it. The careful documentation impulse. The specific awareness that what you are seeing is the kind of thing that the language of your discipline is not equipped to describe without distortion, either the distortion of overclaiming or the distortion of underclaiming, both of which do damage to the truth of what you are trying to record. He had been careful. His camera documentation from month 5 was the most methodical section of his records. Image by image. Measurement by measurement. The features on the cavity floor described in language that maintained scientific form even as the content of what was being described pushed against the boundaries of what scientific form could hold. The structures were regular. Not perfectly regular, not the machine regularity of manufactured objects. but regular in the way that things made with intention are regular. The spacing between them was consistent. The proportions of individual features were internally consistent. The material, and this was the section of the camera documentation that Hartwell had flagged with 3 separate notations asking for peer review that had apparently never come, the material was not ice. Not rock. Not any geological substance that the spectrographic instruments could identify against known references. Something else. Something that the instruments categorized as a material of unknown composition with physical properties that did not correspond to any entry in the reference database. At the base of the largest structure, approximately 12 meters in height, rising from the cavity floor at the center of the arrangement, the camera had captured an image that Hartwell had attached to his log without annotation. I looked at the image for a long time. It showed the base of the central structure. The material of it, which was dark in a way that the camera's light source made darker rather than illuminating. And in the material of the base, at approximately floor level, a feature that the camera's resolution rendered imperfectly but adequately. An opening. Not a crack. Not a fracture. An opening. With edges that had the specific geometry of something designed to be an opening. Something made to allow passage. A door. Below 3 kilometers of Antarctic ice. In a cavity that predated human civilization by a margin, the dating instruments placed at a number I am going to write in full because abbreviating it would be a form of dishonesty about the scale of what we were dealing with. 840,000 years. The cavity and its contents had been sealed under the ice for 840,000 years. I looked up from the screen. Chen was still looking at the wall. The door, I said. Yes, she said. What's on the other side of it? I said. Hartwell lowered the camera through the opening in month 5, she said. The cable was long enough. He documented what was inside. What was inside? I said. She looked at me. A room, she said. A space. The interior of the central structure. With contents that Hartwell spent 3 weeks analyzing before he stopped analyzing and started doing something else. What did he start doing? I said. She turned back to the screen. Opened the month 6 records. Reading, she said. I looked at the month 6 records. They were not research documentation. They were notes. Dense, handwritten and then photographed and uploaded, pages of handwriting that had started controlled and become less controlled as the weeks progressed. Not in any way that suggested breakdown. In the way that handwriting changes when the person producing it is writing faster than their normal pace because what they are trying to capture is moving faster than their normal pace. Hartwell had been transcribing. The interior of the central structure, the room through the door below the ice, had walls. And the walls had surfaces. And the surfaces had something on them that Hartwell's camera had captured in sufficient resolution for him to spend 3 weeks working on in month 5 and then spend the entirety of month 6 transcribing with the urgency of someone who understood that the time available to him was not the time he needed. The surfaces had markings. Not random. Not decorative. Arranged in the specific density and organization of a system carrying meaning. Of language. Not human language. Not any language in any system Hartwell had access to reference. But language in the structural sense, in the sense that the arrangements had internal consistency, had repeating elements that functioned like grammar, had variation with inconsistency that functioned like vocabulary, had a scale and scope that suggested not a fragment or a sample but something more complete. A record. Something had written something on the walls of a room below 840,000 years of Antarctic ice. And Hartwell had spent month 6 trying to transcribe it before he ran out of time. Why did he run out of time? I said. The record stopped 6 weeks before he left. What happened in those 6 weeks? Cheng closed the partition. He sent us what he had, she said. The transcription. Incomplete. And then he filed a medical request for evacuation. He said he was not physically unwell. She paused. He said he was epistemically unwell. That he had read enough of the transcription to understand what it said, and that understanding what it said was incompatible with continuing to function normally in the role of a research scientist. "What does the transcription say?" I said. She stood. "That," she said, "is what you are here to find out. You were specifically selected for this position because your published work in glaciology and your secondary qualification in ancient language systems made you the closest available match to the skill set the transcription requires." "Ancient language systems," I said slowly. "You think I can decode it?" "Hartwell couldn't finish," she said. "He got far enough to understand something but not far enough to understand it completely. Far enough to need to leave but not far enough to know whether leaving was the right decision." She walked to the door of the research room. "The transcription is in a separate file," she said. "I'll give you access tomorrow. Tonight I need you to sleep and I need you to be rested because once you begin with the transcription I do not expect resting will be easy." "Why not?" I said. She stopped in the doorway. "Because Hartwell said the transcription was addressed," she said. "Not to a general reader. Not to whoever found it. Not to humanity in the abstract." "Addressed to who?" I said. She looked at me for a long moment with the expression of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and is now, carefully and deliberately, beginning to set it down. "To whoever came next," she said. "Whoever came to this station. Whoever lowered the camera. Whoever was going to read it." "To us," I said. "To us," she said. "Written 840,000 years ago. To whoever would be standing in this exact position. At this exact moment. In a research station built over a borehole that reached the only place on the surface of this planet where what was written could be found." She walked out. I sat in the research room with the closed partition on the screen and the cold coming up through the floor from 3 kilometers below and the silence that the wind and the heating systems were not quite enough to cover. Something had known we were coming. 840,000 years ago. It had known exactly where we would build and exactly what we would find and exactly when we would find it. And it had left us a message. I was going to read it in the morning. I did not sleep. Chen gave me access to the transcription file at 7 a.m. Not the camera footage first. Not the instrument data that I had spent half the night cross-referencing against published subglacial research in an attempt to find a framework that could hold what I had read in Hartwell's records. The transcription directly. As if she had decided overnight that the sequence of information didn't matter anymore. That I was going to arrive at the same place regardless of the order in which the pieces arrived and that the direct route was kinder than the scenic one. The file was large. Not in the way research files are large, not the bulk of instrument data or image archives. Large in the way that text is large when there is a great deal of it. Hartwell's transcription ran to 237 pages of transliterated symbols, each page accompanied by his working notes on the structural patterns he was identifying, the grammatical logic he was attempting to construct, the vocabulary clusters he was isolating and testing against each new page of source material. He had been thorough. The transcription work was the best work in his records, better than his glaciology, which was already excellent. The focus of someone who had found the most important thing they would ever find and was applying every capacity they had to the task of capturing it before time ran out. I spent the first 2 hours reading his methodology notes rather than the transcription itself. Understanding how he had approached the decoding before I attempted to advance it. The structural patterns he had identified were solid. His grammatical logic was sound. His vocabulary clusters corresponded to the internal consistency I could see in the symbol arrangements even without his analysis. He had been close. That was the thing that the methodology notes made clear. He had been within weeks of producing a coherent translation of the opening sections when he had filed his evacuation request and left. Close enough that what he had produced was a foundation rather than a fragment. A platform I could build from rather than a rubble I had to sort. I began building at 9 a.m. I will not walk you through the technical process of the translation work. It would take more pages than the translation itself, and it would be dishonest in the way that all descriptions of creative or analytical work are dishonest. They make the process sound more linear, more deliberate, more controlled than it actually is. The actual process was hours of staring at symbol arrangements until the arrangement started talking back. Until the internal logic of the system became legible the way a language becomes legible, not through decoding but through immersion, through the accumulation of pattern recognition that eventually produces comprehension without being able to account for the exact moment comprehension arrived. By the end of the first day I had the opening sections. By the end of the third day I had enough to understand why Hartwell had left. And by the end of the fifth day I had enough to know that leaving was not something I was going to be able to do in the same way Hartwell had done it. Not because I was unable to request evacuation. Because I was unable to leave what I was reading in a state of incompleteness. Because the thing being said in the transcription was the kind of thing that exists in a different category once you have begun to receive it. The category of things that cannot be unread. That changed the shape of every other thing you know simply by existing in the same mind. I will tell you what it said. Not in the symbol system. In the closest English I could construct from the structural logic Hartwell had established and the 6 months of translation work that followed his departure. An approximation. The way all translations are approximations, honest about what they are, aware of what they cannot fully carry across the gap between the original and the language of arrival. It began with a statement of origin. We came from a place that no longer exists in a form you would recognize. The distance is not spatial. You do not have the mathematics yet for the kind of distance we mean. What you need to understand is that the distance was crossed and that what crossed it arrived here. We arrived when your world was young in the way that young means something to you. When the ice was different from the ice it is now. When the creatures that would become you were present but were not yet what they would become. We did not come to your world because we chose it specifically. We came to your world because your world was the one at the end of the crossing. The crossing goes where it goes. Your world was where it went. I read that opening and I sat with it for a long time. Something had crossed a distance that our mathematics could not describe and had arrived on this planet at a point in its history when our ancestors were present but had not yet become human in any meaningful sense. 840,000 years ago. The ice cores from that depth carried atmospheric records of an Earth that was familiar in its chemistry and alien in its ecology. They had been here that long. The transcription continued. We were not what you would call living in the way you are living. This distinction matters and we want to be precise about it because the imprecision of the distinction has caused difficulties in previous communications. Previous communications. I stopped. Went back. Read it again. Previous communications. I flagged it in my working notes and continued. The transcription would address it. I knew from the structural analysis of the later sections that the previous communications reference was not incidental. That it was one of several threads that the text returned to and developed as it progressed. We were not living in your sense because what we were did not require the processes your living requires. We did not consume. We did not reproduce in the biological sense. We did not age in the way that aging means for you, the accumulation of damage, the approach of terminus. We were, in your language, something closer to pattern than to organism. Information sustained in a configuration that persisted without the biological machinery that your existence requires to sustain information. Pattern rather than organism. I thought about adjacent space and the substrate and the things that had been watching research teams for 17 years, and I set the thought aside because this was not adjacent space. This was something older than any portal and any facility and possibly older than the frameworks we had developed to think about such things at all. When we arrived we assessed your world. We found it suitable for observation. We found the creatures that would become you particularly interesting for reasons that the subsequent record addresses in detail. We established this location as a point of record because the geological formation beneath the ice, the cavity that your instruments will have detected and that your technology will have eventually reached, offered stability across the timescale we anticipated. We anticipated the timescale correctly. You are reading this at approximately the time we predicted you would read it. The prediction was not difficult. The development of the technology required to reach this depth follows a progression from the cognitive development that your kind began approximately 800,000 years ago and that has been, with the exception of several significant interruptions we will address, relatively consistent. They had predicted us. Not specifically, not the individual researchers, not the specific station, not any of the details. But the general shape of us. The point in our development at which we would reach the depth at which they had left the record. And they had been approximately correct. We want to tell you several things. We will tell them in order of what we believe will be most difficult to receive, beginning with the least difficult and progressing to the most. This ordering is based on our observation of your cognitive and emotional architecture across 800,000 years of attendance. We believe we understand the sequence in which information of this nature can be best received by minds of your type. They had ordered the information. For us. Based on 800,000 years of watching us. The least difficult first. I read what came next and I thought, this is the least difficult. This is where they started. The thing you call the universe is not the thing it appears to be from inside it. This is not a revelation we expect to surprise you. Your physics has been approaching this understanding for several centuries and your most recent theoretical frameworks are closer to the actual nature of the universe than any of your previous models. We tell you this not to surprise you but to confirm that the direction you have been moving in is the correct direction. The universe is a record. Not a physical process. Not a mechanical unfolding of initial conditions across time. A record. In the sense that a book is a record, a fixed thing in which everything that will happen has already happened and the experience of moving through it is a function of the reader's position rather than a function of the events themselves. You are not moving through time. Time is moving through you. The distinction matters enormously and we will not elaborate on it here because the elaboration requires mathematics you do not yet have. What we want you to understand for the purpose of what follows is simply this: everything that has happened and everything that will happen is equally real and equally fixed, and your experience of the present moment as unique and privileged is an artifact of your cognitive architecture rather than a feature of reality itself. I put down my pen. The room was very quiet. The wind against the outer walls. The heating system. The silence underneath. I picked up the pen. I kept reading. The thing we want to tell you that we believe will be most difficult, the thing we have placed at the end of this record, that you will reach when you have processed what precedes it, concerns what we found when we arrived. What was already here? What had been here before us? What is still here now as you read this and has been here continuously across the 800,000 years of this record's existence? Something had been here before them. Something that was still here. As I read, I looked up from the screen. The station was quiet. The other researchers in their various spaces. The Antarctic outside doing its perpetual indifferent thing. The cold coming up through the floor from 3 kilometers below. I read the sentence again. What is still here now as you read this? Not was here. Is here. Present tense. 840,000 years ago they had written something down in a room below the ice and they had used present tense. Because from where they existed, in a universe that was a record rather than a process, present and past and future were not different locations. And what was here when they arrived was still here because it had always been here, because in a universe that is a record everything that is has always been and will always be. The thing that had been here before them was still here. Now. As I read, I closed the laptop. I sat in the station's research room with the Antarctic silence and the cold from below and the understanding that the translation had given me of the opening sections, the universe as record, time as reader, something present in this world that predated even the things that had crossed a distance our mathematics couldn't describe, and I felt the specific quality of a framework that has been pushed past its limit and is deciding whether to break or expand. It expanded. Barely. Enough. I opened the laptop. I kept reading. There were 190 more pages. And the information had been ordered from least to most difficult. I had been reading the least difficult part. I read through the night. Not because I chose to stay awake. Because the quality of what I was reading made sleep impossible in the way that certain experiences make sleep impossible, not through anxiety or fear but through a kind of cognitive activation that the brain cannot stand down from once it has been engaged at that level. The translation work and the content of the translation and the two things together produced a state that I have no clinical name for and that I can only describe as the opposite of rest. Not exhaustion. Its opposite. The feeling of a system running at full capacity because full capacity has been made necessary by what it is processing. By 4 I had reached the section of the transcription that addressed what had been here before them. I will tell you what it said. When we arrived, we conducted a full assessment of this world's physical and biological systems. The assessment was thorough and took considerable time by your measurement. What we found in the biological systems was consistent with our observations of other worlds in the progression of their development, complex chemistry producing increasingly organized structures, the emergence of self-replicating information, the slow elaboration of that information into forms of increasing complexity and eventually awareness. What we found in the physical systems was not consistent. The physical constants of this world, the specific values of the forces and relationships that govern how matter and energy behave, were wrong. Not wrong in the sense of defective. Wrong in the sense of being precisely, specifically, deliberately set to values that differed from the baseline values of the universe in ways that had no natural explanation. This world's physical constants had been set. The way you set the parameters of a system before you run it. The way you calibrate an instrument before you use it. The values had been chosen and implemented with a precision that no natural process could produce. Someone had been here before us and had adjusted the fundamental settings of this world's physical reality before leaving. We do not know who. This is the most significant admission this record contains, and we want to be precise about it. We arrived from a place where the crossing is possible, and the crossing gives access to a great deal of what your universe contains, and we have observed more of it than your current scientific understanding would consider possible. In all of that observation we have encountered nothing that explains who set the physical constants of this world and why. What we can tell you is what the setting accomplishes. The specific values of this world's physical constants produce, as their necessary consequence, the emergence of a particular kind of awareness. Not biological awareness in general, the universe contains many varieties of that and they emerge under a range of physical conditions. A specific kind. The kind that experiences time as a direction. The kind that experiences itself as separate from what surrounds it. The kind that asks questions about what it is and where it came from and what the answers mean. Your kind. The physical constants of this world were set to produce your kind of awareness specifically. As a necessary consequence of their values. Not as a possibility or a tendency or a likely outcome. As a certainty. Given those constants, given the chemistry and the biology that follows from them, given the time required for the elaboration of complexity, your existence was not an accident. It was an outcome. A specific, intended, calibrated outcome of parameters that were set before the first cell divided in the first ocean of this world. Someone made this world to make you. We do not know who. But they were here. And based on the precision of the calibration, and based on what the calibration produces, and based on a quality that we detected in the physical substrate of this world that we have detected nowhere else in our observation, they may still be here. Not in any form that your senses can detect without assistance. Not in any form that your current instruments can measure. But present in the substrate in a way that the calibration itself suggests was intended to persist. The thing that set your world's constants did not leave. It is still here. In the world you stand on. In the ground under your feet. In the physical laws that govern every process in your body and your mind. It has been here for longer than the ice above this record. It has been here for longer than this planet. And the calibration it performed, the setting of parameters that produced you as a necessary outcome, suggests that it is still performing a function. Still attending to the process it initiated. Still present in the substrate of this world in a way that is not passive but active. Not remnant but engaged. We do not know what it wants. We have been here for 800,000 years and we have not been able to determine what the calibrator wants from what it calibrated. But we know it is waiting for something. The specific configuration of the parameters suggests a process building toward a threshold. A point at which the awareness that was calibrated into existence reaches a level of complexity and a level of self-understanding sufficient for something to occur that the calibration was building toward. We believe you are approaching that threshold. We believe that is why you are reading this now. I stopped reading. I sat in the research room at 4 a.m. in an Antarctic research station with the wind doing its indifferent thing outside and the silence underneath and the cold coming up from below, and I held what I had just read inside a framework that was expanding as fast as it could and was still not large enough. Someone had set the physical constants of this world to produce us as a necessary outcome. And the someone was still here, in the substrate, attending to the process, waiting for a threshold. I picked up my pen. I wrote in my working notes, cross-reference with previous accounts. The substrate presence documented in other research contexts, the adjacent space work, the lower laboratory work, the subglacial organism hypothesis, are these the same thing? Is this the same presence described from different angles? Or is the calibrator separate from what the other researchers encountered? I wrote it and then I stopped. Other research contexts. The adjacent space work. The lower laboratory work. I had not mentioned those in any document available to anyone at this station. They were things I had read. Private reading. Research I had encountered in my academic work that occupied a particular shelf in my mind labeled things that do not fit the standard framework but that have the quality of being true. I looked at what I had written. Then I looked at the sentence in the transcription. We believe you are approaching that threshold. We believe that is why you are reading this now. Not that is why someone is reading this. That is why you are reading this. You. Specifically. I read the next section. The previous communications we referenced in the opening of this record require explanation. We have left records at other locations on this world. Not many. The geological stability required for a record to survive the timescale we were operating across limits the available site significantly. But there are others. What we found, across the duration of our attendance, was that the records were found in sequence. Not simultaneously. Not randomly. The threshold approach that the calibration produces does not result in every member of a species understanding simultaneously. It results in specific individuals, with specific qualities, finding specific records at specific times. The sequence is not coincidental. The individuals who find the records are the same individuals who have been finding each other. You have been finding each other. Not in this lifetime. Not in the way that finding each other means to you. Across the accounts. Across the records. The people who sit in the rooms where these things are discovered are not random samples of your population. They are a specific group, returning in different forms at different times, each one adding to the understanding that the previous ones built. You have been building this understanding for longer than this record has existed. You did not know that. You know it now. I put down the pen. I thought about the researchers in the rooms. The AI lab. The lower laboratory with its 11 containment fields. The recovery company with its portal and its tether and its 4,312 items. The prison for things that shouldn't exist. The cryosleep facility with its open pods. The interview who had stood at a tree line at 7 years old and felt something look back. The same people. Returning. Building. I had read those accounts. Not in any official capacity. Not as research. As the kind of reading you do when something calls to you from across the distance of another person's experience and you follow the call without being able to explain why. They had called to me. Because I was one of them. And this record, this room below the ice at 3 kilometers and 400 meters, was the one I had been built toward. The The one that the specific configuration of what I was and what I knew and what I had spent my life moving toward without knowing I was moving toward it had been pointing at. The calibration had produced me as a necessary outcome of parameters set before the first cell divided. For this, I sat with that for a long time. Then I kept reading, because there were still 140 pages. And the information had been ordered from least to most difficult. And I had not yet reached the most difficult part. The section that began on page 97 was titled in the symbol system with a character that I had not been able to translate adequately in my working notes. I had written 3 attempts next to it, each one crossed out, and finally settled on a word that was not quite right but was the closest available. The word was warning. There is something you need to know about what is below this record. Below the record. Below the room. Below the door in the base of the central structure. The record was in the room. The room was in the cavity. The cavity was 3 kilometers and 400 meters below the surface ice. And below the record there was something else. The cavity in which this record is housed is not the deepest feature of this location. Below the cavity there is a second space. Deeper. Older. Not formed by the geological processes that formed the cavity. Formed by the calibration itself. A feature of the original parameter setting that the calibrator left as we do not have adequate language for what it is. The closest we can offer is a mechanism. A component of the calibration that is still active. Still running. Still performing its function in the process that the calibration was designed to produce. We have not interacted with it directly. We have observed it from the cavity. We have measured it to the degree that our instruments allow, and our instruments do not allow much. What we know is that it is active and has been active continuously across our 800,000 years of attendance. What we know is that it is connected to the substrate presence we described. What we know is that it responds. Not to everything. Not to ambient stimulus or random perturbation. To specific things. Specific conditions. It responds to understanding. When the awareness it was calibrated to produce reaches a sufficient level of self-understanding, when the threshold is approached closely enough, the mechanism responds. We have observed it respond 3 times in 800,000 years. Each response was preceded by a period in which specific individuals were finding specific records. Building the understanding. We believe a 4th response is approaching. We believe the 4th response is what this entire sequence of records has been building toward. We do not know what the response produces. In each of the 3 previous responses we observed a period of significant change that we were unable to fully characterize. Changes in the individuals involved. Changes in the physical substrate readings. Changes that did not persist in forms we could document but that left traces. Residues. Small permanent alterations in the way the substrate interfaced with the visible layer. We do not know if the response is something you should pursue or something you should avoid. We cannot make that determination for you. What we can tell you is that the mechanism is directly below the cavity floor. That it can be reached. That reaching it is what the calibration has been building toward since the first parameter was set. And that whatever waits below has been waiting for 800,000 years. And knows you are coming. I closed the laptop. The cold from below was stronger than it had been. Not measurably, not in any way the station's instruments would log as a significant deviation from baseline. But present in a way that the body registers before the instruments do. A quality. A depth. Something below knowing I was coming. The same something that had set the physical constants of this world to produce me as a necessary outcome. Still active. Still running. And 3 responses across 800,000 years. And a 4th approaching. I looked at the floor of the research room. At the ice under the station. At the 3 kilometers and 400 meters between me and the cavity. And below the cavity, the mechanism. And below the mechanism, the oldest thing in the world. Waiting. I brought the translation to Chen at 6 a.m. Not a summary. Not the version edited for palatability. The full working translation, all 237 pages of symbol transcription and corresponding English approximation, with my methodology notes and the cross-references I had built across the 5 days of translation work and the specific flagged sections that I believed required immediate discussion before any other station business occurred. She read for 3 hours without speaking. I made coffee. I sat across from her at the research room table and I watched the Antarctic morning do its pale, flat thing through the station window, and I thought about the section of the translation I had not been able to adequately annotate. The section about the previous responses. The 3 occasions across 800,000 years when the mechanism below the cavity had responded to the threshold being approached. The changes it had produced in the individuals involved. Changes that did not persist in forms that could be documented but that left traces. I thought about Hartwell's evacuation request. His statement that he was epistemically unwell. That understanding what the transcription said was incompatible with continuing to function normally in the role of a research scientist. He had not gotten far enough into the translation to reach the section about the mechanism. He had gotten far enough to understand that the physical constants of this world had been set deliberately, that something was still present in the substrate, that the record had been written with specific knowledge of who would read it and when. That had been enough for him. I had read 237 pages. Chen put down the translation. She looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked at me. "You read all of it," she said. "Yes," I said. "The mechanism section," she said. "You read the mechanism section." "Yes," I said. "And you're still here," she said. Not with surprise exactly. With the quality of someone checking a fact that matters. "I'm still here," I said. "Hartwell wasn't able to stop at the right point," she said. "He got far enough to be destabilized and not far enough to be reoriented. The destabilization without the reorientation is what made him leave. The reorientation comes from the full picture," I said. "From reading all of it. The most difficult section is the one that makes the rest of it hold together rather than fall apart." "The mechanism," she said. "The mechanism," I said. "Because the mechanism is why we're here. Why this station was built here. Why the consortium chose this location and invested in drilling to this depth. Why Hartwell was recruited and why I was recruited and why the translation required both of us, his foundation and my completion." She was quiet for a moment. "The consortium," I said. "They know. Don't they?" She looked at the translation on the table. "The consortium was founded by people who had been looking for something like this for a long time," she said. "Not this specifically, they did not know the content of what was below the ice. But they knew something was below the ice in this location because they had access to geophysical readings that the public record does not contain, and the readings pointed here." "How did they get those readings?" I said. "They were given them," she said. I sat with that. "By who?" I said. She picked up the translation. Turned to the section I had flagged on previous communications. "The records at other locations," she said. "The ones the text references. Some of them were found before this one. Not by researchers. By people who were not in the position to understand what they had found but who passed what they found to people who were in that position. The consortium's founders," I said. "Some of them," she said. "Others came to it differently. Through the kind of research that doesn't appear in mainstream academic literature. Through the kind of findings that get classified or dismissed or quietly buried because the institutions that receive them don't have frameworks for what to do with them." I thought about adjacent space and substrate and the lower laboratory and the cryosleep facility and the prison for things that shouldn't exist and the interviewer who had stood at a tree line at 7 years old. The people who found each other. "The consortium is made of the people who were building the understanding," I said. "The specific individuals the text describes. Coming back. Finding each other. Some of them," she said. "The ones who found their way to each other in this iteration. Not all of them know what they're part of. Most of them think they're doing research. Which they are. But the research is directed by something that has been directing it for longer than the research has been happening. The calibrator, I said. The calibrator, she said. It's been steering us toward the mechanism, I said. Through the research. Through the people who find each other. Through the sequence of records and the understanding they build. It's been building the threshold conditions. Actively. For the fourth response. Yes, she said. The room was very quiet. What does the fourth response produce? I said. You said the consortium has been looking for something. What are they looking for? She stood. Walked to the window. The flat white Antarctic outside doing its indifferent thing. Contact, she said. Not in the way that word usually means. Not signal or communication or the kind of contact that produces data you can file a paper about. The kind of contact that the text describes as the purpose of the calibration. The reason the parameters were set to produce your kind of awareness specifically. What is the reason? I said. She turned from the window. Because your kind of awareness, she said, is the only kind that can do what needs to be done. In the universe as a record. In the fixed text that contains everything that has happened and will happen. Your kind of awareness, the kind that experiences time as a direction, that experiences itself as separate from what surrounds it, that asks questions about what it is the only kind that can read the record from inside it. I stared at her. The universe is a record, I said slowly. And we are the readers. The calibration produced readers, she said. Specifically. That is what the parameters are set to produce. Not intelligence in general. Not awareness in general. Readers. The kind of mind that encounters a text and asks what it means and builds the meaning into something that did not exist before the reading. And the calibrator needs readers, I said. Because? Because it wrote something, she said. Something that requires reading to be complete. That exists in a state of incompleteness until the reading occurs. Like a book that is unfinished until it is read. The concept settled into me with a weight that pushed everything else aside. The universe as a record. Written by something. Requiring readers to be complete. The readers calibrated into existence specifically for the purpose. The threshold approaching when the readers had built sufficient understanding to do what readers do. To read. The mechanism below the cavity, I said. It's not a machine. It's not a piece of equipment. It's the text, she said. The part of the record that requires the reading to complete itself. The part that cannot be finished until the readers are ready. She walked to her desk. Picked up a folder. The consortium wants to go down, she said. To the cavity. Into the room. Past the door in the central structure. To what is below. To read it, I said. To attempt the reading, she said. Whether it is possible, whether the reading is something human awareness can actually do without the mathematics we don't yet have and the frameworks we haven't yet built, is what the attempt will determine. And if it's not possible? I said. If the attempt fails. She opened the folder. Inside it a series of approvals. Consortium level. The names on the approvals were names I did not recognize but that carried the specific weight of institutional authority, the kind that moves money and equipment and people across the planet to an Antarctic research station because something below the ice has been waiting to be read. The 3 previous responses, she said. The text says they produce changes that left traces. The consortium believes the traces are what we have. The research. The understanding. The people who find each other. Each response advanced the reading further than the previous one and left the traces in the individuals involved, and those individuals passed the traces forward. In the next life, I said. In the next iteration. Yes, she said. So if we fail, I said. If the attempt is beyond what we can do. The traces remain, she said. What we understand passes forward. The next iteration builds from here. But if we succeed, I said. She looked at the folder. If we succeed, she said, the reading is complete. The record is finished. The thing the calibration was building toward has been built. She paused. We don't know what that means. The text doesn't say what a completed reading produces. The previous 3 responses got closer, but none of them completed it. We are working from inference rather than example. The consortium is willing to try something they don't know the outcome of, I said. The consortium has been working toward this for 30 years, she said. The people in it have been working toward it for considerably longer than that, in the sense the text describes. Yes. They are willing. She placed the folder on the table. The question, she said, is whether you are. I looked at the folder. At the approvals. At the 2 keycards on top of it, both required to unseal the borehole cap at the drilling facility. How do we get down? I said. 3 kilometers and 400 meters. The drill cable isn't rated for a human descent. There is equipment, she said. Designed for exactly this descent. It arrived 3 weeks before you did. You were waiting for the translation to be complete, I said. We were waiting for you, she said. I picked up one of the keycards. Who goes? I said. You and me. The text specifies the conditions for the reading, she said. Not the number of people. Not the specific individuals. Only that the readers must have reached the threshold understanding. Must have built what the previous iterations built and added to it. How do we know if we've reached it? I said. She picked up the second keycard. We go down, she said. And we find out. I held the keycard in my hand and I thought about the cold coming up through the floor. About the mechanism below the cavity, still active, still running across 800,000 years, responding to understanding when it reached sufficient depth. About the universe as a record waiting to be read. About the calibration that had produced us as a necessary outcome of parameters set before the first cell divided in the first ocean of this world. We were not accidents. We were readers. And the text was below. When? I said. Tomorrow morning, she said. The descent team will need the full day to prepare the equipment. We go down at 0600. She picked up the folder and walked to the door. Get some sleep, she said. Tonight if possible. Will it be possible? I said. She stopped in the doorway. No, she said. But try anyway. She walked out. I sat at the research table with the keycard in my hand and the translation in front of me and the cold coming up through the floor from 3 kilometers and 400 meters below and something below that, older than the ice, older than the planet, active and attending and waiting for the reading to be completed. I tried to sleep. I was right that it wasn't possible. At 4 am I gave up and went back to the translation and read the final 20 pages that I had not yet reached. I will not tell you what they said. Not because I am protecting you from it. Because what they said was the kind of thing that belongs to the reading rather than to the description of the reading. The kind of thing that changes what it is when it is transmitted second-hand. What I will tell you is that after I read them I sat in the research room with the Antarctic dark outside and the cold below and the translation in front of me and I felt the specific quality of a person who has reached the end of the preparation and is now at the beginning of the thing the preparation was for. Ready. Not calm. Not unafraid. Ready. I picked up the keycard. I went to find Chen. We had 4 hours until 0600. We spent them in the research room together, not talking much, the translation between us, the Antarctic holding its indifferent silence around the station like a reminder that whatever happened next was not about the continent. It was about what was below it. And us. And whether we were finally the iteration that finished the reading. The equipment had been designed for exactly this. Not repurposed mining gear or adapted scientific drilling equipment or the kind of improvised solution that Antarctic field research usually required when the standard kit proved inadequate. Purpose-built. Engineered from the beginning for a descent of 3 kilometers and 400 meters through a borehole of specific dimensions into a cavity of specific characteristics. The consortium had known the dimensions because the instrument data from Hartwell's initial survey had been transmitted to them in real time. They had built the equipment before the translation was complete because they had understood from the survey data alone that a descent would eventually be required. 30 years of working toward this moment. They had been ready before we were. The descent capsule was suspended in the drilling facility when Chen and I arrived at 5:40 a.m. It held 2 people in facing seats, enclosed in a pressure shell that maintained a stable atmospheric environment regardless of external conditions, connected to a winch system rated for the weight and the distance and the specific stresses of a 3-kilometer descent through a borehole in Antarctic ice. The pilot, if pilot was the right word for the person who operated the winch controls from the surface and monitored the capsule systems throughout the descent, was a man named Rask who had been at the station since before Chen and who moved around the drilling facility with the specific familiarity of someone who had been preparing this equipment for weeks and had long since made his peace with what it was for. He checked the capsule systems without speaking. He checked the winch. He checked the communication line that ran alongside the cable and would maintain voice contact between the capsule and the surface throughout the descent and the time in the cavity and the ascent. Then he looked at us. Descent is approximately 90 minutes, he said. Cavity arrival will be confirmed by the pressure differential sensor. You'll feel the capsule enter the open space before the instruments confirm it. Time in the cavity is not fixed. When you are ready to return, you signal on the comm line and I begin the winch retrieval. Ascent is approximately 2 hours. What's the maximum time we can spend in the cavity? I said. The capsule's atmospheric system is rated for 14 hours, he said. The consortium recommends no more than 8. Why 8 if the system handles 14? Chen said. He looked at the borehole cap. Because no one has been in the cavity before, he said. Because the instrument data tells us certain things and does not tell us other things, and the things it does not tell us include what 8 hours in a space below 3 kilometers of ice does to the people who are in it. He stepped back from the capsule. Ready when you are, he said. Chen looked at me. I looked at the borehole cap. At the 2 authorization seal. At the keycard in my hand and the keycard in Chen's hand and the specific weight of what those 2 pieces of plastic were about to open. We placed the keycards simultaneously. The seal released. The cap lifted on its pneumatic mechanism. The borehole was open. 3 kilometers and 400 meters of shaft descending through Antarctic ice into a cavity that contained a room that contained a translation that had addressed us by name before we were born. The cold that came up from the open borehole was not the cold of ice. I had felt it through the floor of the station for 5 days. The directional cold. The cold with depth and weight. Coming up from below. From something colder than ice. From the open borehole it was immediate and specific and carried a quality I cannot adequately describe except to say that it was the cold of somewhere very old. Not old the way ice is old. Old the way the word old stops being adequate and needs to be replaced by something that means the same thing at a scale that the word old was not built to carry. We got into the capsule. Rask sealed the hatch. The winch engaged. We descended. The first 30 minutes were darkness and the sound of the cable and the feeling of the borehole walls close on either side of the capsule. The pressure shell kept the interior environment stable but could not keep out the quality of the ice around us. The age of it. The weight of it. 3 kilometers of the most ancient atmospheric record on the planet pressing in from every direction, each layer of it a year, each year adding to a compression that was not violent but was absolute. At 50 minutes the character of the ice around us changed. Not visibly. But the capsule's external temperature sensors logged the shift and the display showed it, and I watched the numbers and thought about the section of the translation that described the ice below 2.8 kilometers. The stillness of it. The quality of something the ice had formed around rather than something that had become still as the ice formed. We were in that section of the ice. The ice around us had been still before it was ice. At 80 minutes the pressure differential sensor activated. The capsule entered the cavity. The feeling of it was not what I had expected. Not the dramatic spatial shift of moving from confined to open. Something more gradual. A lightening. A quality of the space around the capsule changing from compressed to available. From closed to holding something. The way a room feels different from a corridor even before you can see that it is a room. Then the capsule's external lights activated automatically and the camera feed on the interior display showed us the cavity. I will try to describe it. The cavity was large in a way that the instrument data had suggested and that the direct visual experience made real in a way the instrument data had not. The capsule's lights reached approximately 50 meters before the resolution fell off into darkness. 50 meters of visible space and beyond that the sonar data suggesting hundreds more. A space below 3 kilometers of ice that should not have been able to exist by any geological process and that existed anyway with the specific quality of something that had been here so long that it had stopped being remarkable to itself. The floor of the cavity was visible below us as the capsule descended. And rising from the floor, exactly as the camera footage from Hartwell's cable descent had shown, the structures. From inside the capsule, from this distance, with the lights of the capsule illuminating them from above, they had a quality that the camera footage had not communicated. Not threatening. Not cold. Not the alien geometry of something made by a process with no relationship to human experience. Familiar. In the specific way that the translation's contents had been familiar, not recognizable in the sense of having seen them before, but familiar in the sense of corresponding to something. Of matching a shape that had been waiting in the mind without a name. The central structure rose from the floor of the cavity 12 meters high. The material of it dark in a way that absorbed the capsule's lights rather than reflecting them, making it more present rather than less visible. And at its base, exactly where the camera footage had shown it, the opening. The door. Rask's voice came through the comm line. Cavity confirmed. Capsule stable. You have comms. Report status. We're in the cavity, Chen said. Visual on the structures. Preparing to disembark. The disembarkation was the part of the process that the consortium's equipment designers had given the most attention. A pressurized exit procedure that maintained the capsule's atmospheric integrity while allowing the occupants to move into the cavity environment. The cavity atmosphere, the instrument data had established this during Hartwell's initial survey, was breathable. Not comfortably. Not in the way that surface air is breathable. But adequate for the purposes of a limited excursion with supplemental equipment. We put on the supplemental equipment. We went through the exit procedure. We stepped out of the capsule and into the cavity. The floor of the cavity was solid. Not ice. The material from the translation's description, unknown composition, properties that did not correspond to any entry in the instrument reference database, was underfoot and it was solid and it was warm in a way that the ice above it was not warm. Not uncomfortably warm. The specific temperature of something that had been maintained at a precise value for a very long time by something that wanted it maintained. The central structure was 30 meters from where the capsule had set down. We walked toward it. The walk was the most remarkable 30 meters I have ever covered. Not because of what we passed. Because of what the space felt like to move through. The cavity had the quality I had been feeling through the floor of the station for 5 days, the deep, ancient, attending quality, and inside the cavity that quality was not directional anymore. It was everywhere. It was the air and the floor and the walls of the space and the dark material of the structures, and it was attending to us in the specific, focused, personal way that the translation had described. The threshold being approached. The mechanism responding. It knew we were here. Not the way an alarm system knows an intrusion. The way a reader knows when someone picks up their book. We reached the central structure. The door at its base was exactly as the camera footage had shown. The geometry of it precise and intentional. The edges of it clean in a way that the rest of the structure's surface was not. Made to allow passage. Made specifically for the dimensions of a being of our approximate size. Made for us. Because we had always been coming. Because the parameters had been set to produce exactly us and exactly this moment, and the mechanism below had been waiting with the patience of something that was not subject to the experience of waiting in any way that produced impatience. Chen looked at the door. The translation said the room has writing on every wall, she said. Yes, I said. And below the room, she said. Below the floor of the room. The mechanism. Yes, I said. We go in, she said. Not a question. We go in, I said. She went through the door first. I followed. The room was larger than the external dimensions of the structure suggested it should be. Not impossibly larger. But larger in the way that the translation had prepared me for, a space that the structure had been built to contain and that the structure was not quite adequate to contain, the interior spilling slightly past what the exterior implied. The walls were covered. Every surface. Floor to ceiling, the full circumference of the room, covered in the symbol system that Hartwell had transcribed and I had translated and that had addressed us by name before we were born. Not copies of the translation I had read. The translation I had read had been the text on the walls of the antechamber. The outer layer. The message left for whoever came. The walls of this room held something else. Something more. I stood in the center of the room and I looked at the walls, and the walls looked back, and the quality of the cavity's attending presence was concentrated here in a way that made the rest of the cavity feel ambient by comparison. And in the floor of the room, at the center, a feature I had been told about and had not fully imagined. An opening. Smaller than the door. Large enough for a person. Leading down. Into darkness. Into the mechanism. Into something that had been waiting below 840,000 years of record for the reading to be ready. Chen stood beside me. She looked at the walls. At the symbols. At the density and the scope of what was written there. Can you read it? She said. I looked at the walls. And the walls looked back. And somewhere in the reading something began. Not in the walls. Not in the room. In me. The specific quality of comprehension arriving not through the mechanism of language but directly. The way it had arrived in other rooms, in other contexts, for other people who were also me, in ways the translation had tried to explain and had only partially managed. The walls were not new text. The walls were the record. The full record. Not the message for the finder. The thing itself. The text of the universe as written by whoever had written it. The complete document of which everything, every physical law, every constant, every calibrated parameter that had produced every cell of every being that had ever lived on this world, was a sentence. And at the center of the floor. The opening. The mechanism. The place where the reading would complete. Chen looked at me. I looked at the opening. We go down, I said. The opening in the floor was 12 steps down. I counted them the way I had counted the steps in other stairwells, in other facilities, in other contexts that the translation had told me were not other contexts at all but the same context returning. 12 steps cut into the material of the room's floor with the same precision as the door in the base of the structure and the markings on the walls. The same intention in every surface. The same quality of something made for a purpose and maintained in service of that purpose across a duration that the word duration was not built to carry. At the bottom of the 12 steps the space opened. Not into a room. Into something that occupied the category of room the way the ocean occupies the category of water, technically accurate and completely inadequate. A space below the room, below the central structure, below the cavity, below 3 kilometers and 400 meters of Antarctic ice. A space that the instruments above had detected and had been unable to characterize, and that the direct experience of standing in it characterized instantly and completely. It was the oldest place I had ever been. Not old the way the ice above it was old. Not old the way the cavity was old. Old in the way that the translation had tried to prepare me for and had not fully managed, because the translation was words and words were a human technology and human technology was 800,000 years old at most, and what I was standing in was older than that by a margin that made 800,000 years look like this morning. The mechanism was not a machine. I want to be precise about that because the word mechanism implies machinery and machinery implies construction and construction implies something built by hands or their equivalent, and what was in that space had not been built in any of those senses. It was grown, or formed, or had simply always been, in the way that certain things in the translation's account of the universe simply always were, the physical constants, the substrate, the parameters themselves. Not created at a point in time. Present across all of time simultaneously. The feature of a record that exists on every page rather than only on the pages where it is explicitly written. The mechanism was the record made visible. Or more precisely, the mechanism was the part of the record that required the reading to become visible. That existed in a state of potentiality until the readers arrived with sufficient understanding to actualize it. The way certain mathematics is real before anyone writes it down but only becomes visible in the writing. We were the writing. The space was lit the way the translation had described the calibrator's presence in the substrate, not with a source, not with a direction, but fundamentally. Lit the way a thing is lit when the light is part of what it is rather than something applied to it. Warm in the same way. Attending in the same way. Chen stood beside me at the bottom of the 12 steps and she looked at the space and she said nothing for a long time. I said nothing either. Some spaces require silence before they require anything else. Before the speaking or the doing or the attempting, a period of simply being in the space and letting the space be what it is and letting what it is land in you the way it lands rather than managing its arrival into something more comfortable. We stood in that silence for what the timer on my equipment later told me was 11 minutes. 11 minutes of standing in the oldest place on the surface of the planet and letting it be what it was. Then Chen said, "The walls in the room above. You said you could read them." "I could receive them," I said. "There's a distinction." "Tell me the distinction," she said. "Reading implies the text is separate from the reader," I said. "That you approach it from outside and extract meaning from it. What happened in the room above was different. The meaning arrived directly. Without the mechanism of reading. The way understanding arrives when you have been building toward something for long enough that the final piece doesn't need to be inserted, it falls into place because the place has been prepared for it. The threshold, she said. The threshold, I said. She looked at the space around us. At the mechanism that was not a machine. At the record made visible in the oldest place below the oldest ice on the surface of the planet. "What did the walls say?" she said. "In the room above." "What did you receive?" I had been trying to find language for it since the moment it happened. Since standing in the center of the room and feeling the comprehension arrive in the direct, complete, unmediated way that the translation had prepared me for and that the preparation had still not been adequate for. The universe is a record, I said. We knew that from the translation. What the walls of the room said, what I received from them, was the rest of that. The part the translation couldn't carry. "What's the rest of it?" she said. "A record requires a reader to be complete," I said. We knew that too. What I didn't understand until the room was why. Not just why a record requires a reader, but why this record required this kind of reader. Why the calibration produced exactly us, time-experiencing, self-separate, question-asking awareness, rather than any other kind. Why, she said. Because the record is about time, I said. It is written in time. The physical constants, the parameters, the calibrated emergence of awareness, all of it is the text of a document that takes time to exist. That requires a reader who experiences time as a direction in order to be read in the sequence that gives it meaning. A reader outside time would see all of it simultaneously. Would see the text the way you see a painting, all at once, without sequence, without the specific experience of one word following another that produces meaning rather than just information. We read it slowly, she said. One moment at a time. One moment at a time, I said. Which is the only way this particular text can be read. Which is why the calibration produced exactly this kind of awareness and not another kind. The text required readers who would read it in the only sequence that made it mean what it was written to mean. She was quiet for a moment. And the meaning, she said. What is the meaning? If we're the readers and this is the text and we're standing in the place where the reading completes, what does it mean? I looked at the mechanism. At the space around us. At the oldest thing in the world attending to us with the patience of something that had been waiting for this exact question. That we are not separate from it, I said. That's what the calibration was for. Not to produce intelligence. Not to produce technology or civilization or the capacity to reach this depth. To produce the specific experience of separateness that makes the reading possible. The experience of being an individual, separate from everything around it, moving through time in a direction. That experience of separateness is what allows the reading. But it's not the end point. What's the end point? She said. The end point, I said, is understanding that the separateness was the reading position. The place you stand to read. Not what you are. The reader is not separate from the text. The reader is part of the text. Was always part of the text. The experience of separateness was the specific cognitive stance required to read the record from inside it. And when the reading is complete, I stopped. Because the mechanism was doing something. Not dramatically. Not with the sudden shift of a system activating or a process beginning. With the specific gradual quality of something that has been at a particular point for a very long time and is now moving from that point to the next one. The way a season changes. The way dawn arrives. No single moment where it happens. A continuous becoming that is only legible in retrospect. The light in the space was changing. Not the quality or the direction, those remained as they had been. The amount of it. The space was becoming more lit in a gradual, sourceless way that it had always been lit, as if the fundamental illumination of the place was increasing. As if the light that was part of what the space was rather than something applied to it had been at a particular level and was now at a higher one. And the attending quality. The presence that had been constant since we entered the cavity. The calibrator in the substrate. The oldest thing in the world that had been here before the ice and before the planet and that was still here in the way that things simply always were. It was closer. Not geographically. Not in any spatial sense. Closer in the sense that something comes closer when the barrier between you and it decreases. When the distance is not meters but understanding and the understanding has reached a point where the distance is almost nothing. Chen felt it. I could see her feel it, the specific expression of someone whose framework is expanding faster than the expansion can be managed and who is choosing not to manage it. Choosing to let the expansion be what it is. It's completing, she said. Not a question. Yes, I said. What do we do? She said. Nothing, I said. That's what the final 20 pages of the translation said. The ones I read at 4 a.m. and didn't tell you the content of. The reading completes itself when the readers are ready. We don't do anything. We just be the readers, she said. Be the readers, I said. The light increased. And the attending presence came closer. And the mechanism, the oldest thing in the world, the feature of the record present on every page, the part of the text that required the reading to become visible, did what it had been built to do across whatever span of time built means when the thing being built is the universe itself. It opened. Not physically. Not in the way a door opens or a lock releases or a machine completes its cycle. In the way that a text opens when the reader reaches the sentence that makes everything before it mean what it was always meant to mean. In the way that a long piece of music opens when the final chord resolves the tension that every previous chord had been building. In the way that a question opens when the answer arrives, not closing the question but opening it further, showing that the question was larger than it appeared and the answer is the beginning of seeing how large. What came through was not information. Not revelation in the sense of a secret disclosed. Not knowledge added to what we already knew. Something that the translation had been pointing toward with every inadequate approximation of its language, and that was now here and that I am going to try to describe and that the description will not contain. It was recognition. The specific quality of being known by something that has always known you. Not observed, known. The difference between a camera and a person. The camera records. The person knows. The oldest thing in the world, the calibrator in the substrate, the thing that had set the parameters to produce us as a necessary outcome, it knew us. Not as data points. Not as the products of its calibration. As the people we were. Specifically. Individually. With the knowledge that comes from having attended to a thing across the entire span of its existence from before its existence to the moment of its completion. It had been watching us become what we were becoming. Not passively. Attending. The way you attend to something you care about. With the specific quality of care that does not interfere, that allows the thing to be what it needs to be, that holds back when holding back is what the process requires, that is present in every moment of the becoming without making itself known until the becoming is ready. 800,000 years of that. Longer than that. From before the first cell to the 12 steps down to this space. And now it was known. Not the attending. The attended. Us. The readers. The specific irreducible awareness that the calibration had produced, and that was now, for the first time in whatever span of time had been building toward this, fully visible to what had made it. Not smaller than I had expected. Larger. In the way that things are larger when you understand them rather than when you are afraid of them. In the way that the world is larger when you know what is in it than when you don't. Chen was crying. Not from fear. Not from overwhelm in the negative sense. The specific tears of someone who has received something they did not know they had been waiting for and whose body is doing the only thing it knows how to do with something that large. I was not crying. I was completely still in the way that the ice at 2.8 kilometers and below was still. The stillness of something that has reached the configuration it was built toward. Not an ending. A resolution. The specific difference between those two things that the translation had been trying to explain from the first page, and that only became fully clear here, in this space, with the recognition of the oldest thing in the world opening in the mechanism at the bottom of the 12 steps. Not an ending. A completion. The reading completing the text. The text completing the reading. The two things not separate. Were never separate. The experience of separateness was the reading position. This was what came after. This was what the reading position had been for. Not to stay separate. To read from the separate position and then to understand that the separateness was the stance and the understanding was the return. We were part of the text. We had always been part of the text. The reading position had let us see that from close enough to understand it. Chen wiped her face. She looked at me. Is it finished? She said. I looked at the mechanism. At the space. At the light that was not more or less than it had been but was different in quality. Completed in quality. The way a room is different after the conversation that needed to happen in it has happened. The reading is finished, I said. What comes after the reading, that's not finished. What comes after, she said. I thought about the traces. The 3 previous responses. The changes that did not persist in forms that could be documented but that left residues. Alterations in the way the substrate interfaced with the visible layer. We go back up, I said. We document everything we can document. We tell everyone we can tell. The consortium, the researchers, the people who are part of this without knowing they're part of this. We build the language that doesn't exist yet for what just happened. And the mechanism, she said. The space below the room. Do we seal it? Protect it? I looked at the opening in the floor of the room above us. At the 12 steps. At the oldest thing in the world that was not below us anymore in the way it had been below us. That was distributed. The way the wave distributes when it reaches shore. Present in the substrate the way it had always been present but differently now. Changed by the reading the way a text is changed by being read. Not altered. Completed. We leave it open, I said. A window. The same way the other windows were left open. So the next people who come here know what they are standing on. She nodded. We went back up the 12 steps. Into the room with the walls. I stood in the center of the room and I looked at the walls one more time. At the record written before the first cell divided in the first ocean of this world. At the text of which everything was a sentence and we were the punctuation at the end of a very long clause. Not the end of the document. The end of this clause. The text continued. It would always continue. That was the nature of it. Chen touched my arm. Rask will be wondering, she said. Yes, I said. We walked back through the door in the base of the central structure. Into the cavity. Across the 30 meters of attending, distributed, completed presence to the capsule. Through the exit procedure in reverse. Into the seats. Hatch sealed. Com line open. Rask, Chen said. We're ready for ascent. A pause on the line. Status, he said. She looked at me. I looked at the borehole above us. At the 3 kilometers and 400 meters of the most ancient atmospheric record on the planet between us and the surface. At the ice that had formed around something rather than the ice becoming still over time. Nominal, I said. Everything nominal. The winch engaged. We ascended. The 2 hours of ascent were the quietest 2 hours I have spent in any space. Not quiet in the absence of sound sense. Quiet in the way that something is quiet after it has said what it needed to say. The specific silence of completion rather than the silence of waiting. We broke the surface of the borehole at 10:14 a.m. Antarctic time. Rask opened the hatch. The Antarctic air came in, cold, dry, indifferent in the way that only the most indifferent place on the surface of the planet can be indifferent. The same indifference as before. And underneath it something different. Not a feeling. Not an impression. A quality in the indifference itself that had not been there before. The specific quality of something that has been attended to for a very long time by something that cares about it, and that carries the trace of that attendance in its texture, in the way that a child carries the trace of being loved even in the moments when no one is watching. The Antarctic did not care about us. But something did. Something that was in the Antarctic and in the ice and in the physical constants that made the cold cold and the white white and the indifference indifferent. Something that had set those constants specifically. For us. And had been watching us become what we were becoming. And had been attended to in return. By the reading. By us. I climbed out of the capsule and stood in the drilling facility and felt the Antarctic around me and the substrate under me and the oldest thing in the world distributed through both in the way it had always been distributed through both and would always be. Rask was looking at us. What happened down there, he said. I thought about how to answer. About the inadequacy of any answer. About the translation and its 237 pages of approximation and how after all of that approximation the thing itself had still arrived in a form that words had not been sufficient to carry. The reading completed, I said. He looked at Chen. She nodded. He looked back at me. And, he said. I walked to the facility door. Opened it. The Antarctic outside. Flat, white, vast, indifferent, billions of years old and not finished and not interested in being finished and holding in its ice and its cold and its absolute lack of concern for human comfort the most ancient record of what this planet had been and was and would be. And underneath it, the mechanism. And underneath the mechanism, the oldest thing in the world. And underneath the oldest thing in the world, the substrate. And in the substrate, the calibration. And in the calibration, us. As a necessary outcome. Not separate. Never separate. The reading position had been the distance required to read. Not the truth of the distance. I turned back to Rask. And now we build the language, I said. For what we found. For what it means. For what comes next. He looked at me for a long moment. How long will that take, he said. I looked at the Antarctic. At the flat white world above the oldest thing in the world. At the indifferent sky above the world that had been calibrated to produce us before the first cell divided. As long as it takes, I said. Is that enough time, he said. I thought about 800,000 years of patience. About 3 previous responses and the traces they left and the understanding those traces had carried forward into the next iteration and the next. About the consortium and the 30 years and the people who found each other and the records they found and the language they had been building across longer than any of them knew. It's always been enough time, I said. I walked out into the Antarctic. The cold was immediate and absolute and completely indifferent. And underneath the indifference, warm. As it had always been. As it would always be.